Hi, welcome to For Better For Verse, the podcast where a married couple, a theologian, and a philosopher are taking on the scriptures. I'm Justin Crisp.
I'm Jewelle Bickle, and today we are talking about Judges and Ruth.
So we are about a month behind in our reading schedule. It's been about a month since our last podcast. We had a number of things that we had to get through. The biggest of which is probably Holy Week and Easter, as well as I had a death in my family. My paternal grandmother died, and so I had gone back to our family home in Tennessee to be a part of her burial. We had a number of other things, the usual garden variety things of our household, bowls and, the dog pooping on the rug and so
It's
on and
just
so
an
forth.
everyday occurrence at this
Unfortunately, so we're living real life, you're living real life, wherever you might be on your biblical study this year. Take heart, our app regularly tells us we are 20 to 30 days behind schedule.
But we are going to catch up.
That's our promise
Our-
every time, is that we're going to catch up.
Well, or we're gonna get through it. How's that sound?
We're eventually going to get to Revelation. We're
We
going to
are
read
going
the
to
last pages. Today we're tackling Judges and Ruth, as you said. Next podcast will be on 1st and 2nd Samuel, and then we'll move into 1st and 2nd Kings. We are going to go today through the sort of the political history of early Israel after the conquest of Canaan, which we saw in the book of Joshua. Then we're going to conclude with the book of Ruth, which is written at a very different time period. The book of Ruth actually dates from the Second Temple period, probably much, much later than the book of Judges. But even though it was written at a much later time than Judges was, it takes place narratively during the time of the Judges. And it's going to set us up for 1st and 2nd Samuel in a way that I think is narratively creative. It's a really beautiful piece of literary work, the book of Ruth.
It is. It is. It's a nice, warm, fuzzy story after Judges,
Totally.
which is not warm and fuzzy.
Let's talk about the opposite of warm and fuzzy.
The opposite of warm and fuzzy is Judges.
So who are judges?
Who are the judges? The judges are leaders of Israel in a time period after they've taken over the promised land, as it were. And they are usually people who have like a special connection to God in some ways, right? So we might call them prophets at other points in scripture, but sort of during this period, they're considered judges because they were some of the ones that you would sort of bring things to weigh, right? So if you remember way back in Deuteronomy and all of those stories we had, bring this to the elders and the elders will weigh on God's behalf, blah, 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 and then we'll decide what to do from there. And that's kind of what they're doing here. Do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, Moses appoints judges after he gets burnt out and tells God, I can't handle this unruly people all by myself. So he appoints judges, and these are kind of his subordinates. They are supposed to be governing the people on his behalf. And I think in a similar way, the judges of Israel at this period are ruling Israel on God's behalf.
On God's behalf, yeah.
There's this recurring theme in the book of Judges that there is no king yet in Israel. The first king of Israel is King Saul. We'll get his story in our next podcast in 1 Samuel. At this point, Israel is kind of a theocracy. Literally, it is actually a government
The definition
thought to be ruled by
God, yes.
But God exercises indirect rule of his people by, having this human intermediary called a judge. And the judges don't have a very easy time of it. Whether their reigns, so to speak, were moments of flourishing for Israel or moments of desolation depends on the particular case. We've got good guys and bad guys, and even the good guys are pretty flawed, with the exception of one really good woman, Deborah, who is maybe the only judge that doesn't really get into serious trouble at any point in her story. I'd have to look a little more closely to make sure, but I know that the portrayal of Deborah is almost univocally positive.
Positive, it is.
That's pretty extraordinary.
And that is not the case for so many of the other judges.
But Deborah is talked about explicitly as a prophet. That's in chapter 4, verse 4. So Deborah is a prophet who is judging Israel, and she has a pretty good run of it. And there's relative peace in Israel in that time. It seems that, people are all right. And there's this beautiful way that the book of Judges describes when there is peace. It uses the phrase, the land had rest. And so it says the land had rest for 40 years at the end of
After
at the end of Deborah's
reign.
narrative.
Yes.
I love the idea of the land literally like just exhaling.
I know, sighing. You can just like feel it go,
Yeah.
like we're
The
okay.
shoulders go down.
Yeah.
The fists are unclenched. And
Just for a little bit.
good for Deborah.
Yes. I think the thing I love about Deborah in particular is this image of her. She used to sit under a palm tree and just have people come up to her and ask for judgments, right? And while doing that, God would talk to her, and that's sort of where she becomes. So she herself is not a fierce warrior, right? She goes and gathers someone else, Barak, I believe, and says, like, you need to lead this. And he's like, I don't really want to. And she's like, I'm coming with you. And he's like, okay, if you come, then I'll do it. Then I'll do it, right? So, but yes, as we've said, sort of she might be the only person who has a really positive depiction.
Yeah. She seems to be an excellent stateswoman. And she reminds me of somebody like, Pericles in ancient Athens or something like that. Seems to be able prudentially to make these judgments, and she rules in wisdom, and the society is well ordered and so on. And so the land has rest as a result of her good
Right. And that people respect and listen to her in a way that they don't always listen to some of the judges that come
Indeed.
after her, as it were. So
then you get Gideon.
Plus one.
Plus one. Then you get Gideon. Gideon, I'd say, Gideon is a mixed bag. Gideon does pretty well until the very end of his life. Gideon is a servant of God. Gideon has great success in the military world of things. He initially proves religiously quite obedient to the Deuteronomistic covenant. He destroys an altar to Baal, an alternate Mesopotamian god whose cult is, indigenous to the land of Canaan, to many of the tribes that dwelled there. So he initially proves successful in government, military, and religion. It's at the end of his life, however, he's proven so successful that this is chapter 8, verse 24. He makes a request of the men of Israel. When they conquer a place, there's plunder. And Gideon asks for all of the earrings that they plundered from their enemies. And they answer, we will willingly give them. And they spread a cloak, and every man threw in it the earrings of his spoil. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, besides the crescent ornaments and the pendants and the purple garments worn by the kings of Midian, whom he had conquered, and besides the collars that were around the necks of their camels. Quite a lot of jewelry. And Gideon made an ephod of it. The ephod is one of those ceremonial garments that we saw is part of the clothing of the high priest in the book of Exodus. There's only supposed to be one of these things. It's only supposed to be worn by the high priest. Gideon has another one made. He says, and Gideon made an ephod of it and put it in his city in Ophrah, and all Israel worshipped it. And it became a snare to Gideon and to his family. So Gideon's rule ends with this moment of idol creation and idol worship, which is contradictory to the whole Deuteronomistic cult. All of these rules that were put in place in Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy for how the worship of the God of Israel is supposed to proceed.
That's interesting, because right after that, though, it says the Midians were subdued and they lifted their heads no more, and the land had rest for 40 years.
That's right.
So there was still political peace, but there was tension.
The seeds for future disobedience were sown.
Yes.
I think.
That makes a lot of sense. And so it seemed like everything was okay.
Yeah.
But there was already some doubt in God.
I think so. This is one of the things that I appreciate most about the book of Judges. If you go to the book of Judges looking for a hero, you're not going to find one, except maybe Deborah. You're not going to find somebody who you want to not just vote for, but also teach your Sunday school class, take care of your dog when you go out of town. There's just not a real warm, fuzzy figure here. And God's involvement in each of the periods of the Judges is not always completely transparent. I think we've gotten a picture up until Judges of God where God is pleased with the people and good things happen to them, or God is displeased with the people and bad things happen to them. And here you have an example of God is not going to approve of something Gideon has done, and yet they
Lets it,
still have flourishing,
right, which
still lets them be.
gives them the illusion
The illusion that they're
that they're
okay,
doing
that they've
okay.
gotten away with it.
Mhm.
But that's a much more variegated and I think realistic theology of history, because I don't have an idea of God's relationship to humanity where humanity does morally bad things and then bad things happen to them because God makes them to happen to them. That is just not how history works, right? Good things happen to bad people and bad things happen to good people all the time, and good things to bad peoples, like communities, nations. Good things happen to bad peoples all the time, and bad things happen to good peoples all the time. And
Mhm.
why they happen is something of a
Yes.
mystery.
Mhm.
Um, it's that more. I hesitate to say sophisticated because that's not exactly it. It's just more. It's more complex.
More complex.
Picture of God's relationship to history is coming to the forefront now.
It is. It is. And I'd say maybe Deborah might be the last of that sort of moment of that, right?
When they're
Of,
holy, flourishing. When they're
Mhm.
unholy, desolation.
Yes, yes. And then, and it lasts for, was it 40 years? But then, but I think that then after Deborah, the coming judges, yeah, it's a lot messier. It's a lot more ambiguous. It's not clear if God's endorsing it or not, which is a lot more like real life, right? Because it's not always clear God's endorsing, what some political figure is or isn't doing.
Totally true. I want to come back to Gideon's son Abimelech in a moment, but maybe we should skip to the story of the judge Samson. Samson, who is famous because Samson was a big, strong man and he could make pillars collapse on top of people and all that. There's a miraculous birth. Samson's mother was barren. God intervenes. There's an angel who appears to Samson's parents in fire, and it says, you're going to bear a son. And Samson's parents vow to make him a Nazarite. And Nazarites were a class of ascetic, meaning they were somebody who lived by a rule religiously that wasn't necessary for every human being or every member of this religious group, but went above and beyond those requirements, particularly
Forever.
in, self-restraint, abstinence, and so on. So Nazarites couldn't cut their hair, supposed to not drink alcohol. They had a lot of rules that they followed, and the Nazarite code, I think, comes from Numbers.
Numbers, that's right.
So they promised that, in exchange for this miraculous birth, they're going to make their miraculous son become a Nazarite. And Samson breaks all of those rules.
Every single one, over and over.
He has a lot of military success. He defeats the Philistines, who are going to become a recurring enemy, military threat to the people of Israel. It's going to go through, 1st and 2nd Samuel, certainly, and on and on. He defeats the Philistines, but you can't say that Samson is a good person, and yet God partners with Samson, I think, partners after a manner of speaking, in order to accomplish some of God's ends. It's like God is triaging Israel's situation. God, who is trying to act as their supernatural king, but is not having a lot of success at it. God partners through the super flawed human being in order to get a couple of small wins for Israel. I mean, this guy makes terrible choices, throws rages for parties, eats unclean animals, tricks other people into eating unclean animals too. He once tricks his parents into doing this.
Yep.
He does every single thing wrong, and yet God does work through him. And that's, I think, much closer to the way real life works. God works through really not so great people and places and so on in order to accomplish, hopefully, some small or even big wins for those communities and hopefully for the whole of humanity. God's only got the crooked timber of humanity to work.
This is his best.
One of your favorites.
Samson's his best tool, and that's not saying much.
There it is.
It's the best resource he has at the times. I mean, you see that over and over again with Samson. But the way in which Judges talks about it is very interesting. So, like chapter 14, verse 4. So he says he wants to go down to get a Philistine woman as his wife, and his parents are like, "Do you really have to do that? Like, can't you get someone from the Jewish people?" And it says his father and mother did not know that this was from the Lord, for he was seeking a pretext to
act against them.
Them meaning the Philistines.
Yes, yes. So it's interesting. It's messy. The whole thing is just messy.
And that's another place where I think you can see the authors of Judges struggling with the theology of providence. Providence is how we believe God interacts creatively with the world he has made. And God interacts with people in the book of Judges in more than one way. That's what we were talking about with the end of the straightforward connection between when the people are holy, good things happen, and when the people are bad,
Mhm.
bad things happen. You've got not just like the mixed bag of Gideon, where Gideon is sowing the seeds of religious idolatry, and yet the land has peace. You've also got God endorsing Samson's sinful desire to marry outside of the people of Israel, which God has forbidden as part of the whole like Joshua ideology.
Yes.
They're only supposed to
Mary.
they're only supposed to marry people from within Israel. He wants to go and marry somebody who is a Philistine, but God endorses it because in God's like big picture scheme of things, God has some kind of beef with the Philistines, and so it's gonna
And so
like
this is going to take care of some of that.
just gonna take care of it. I mean, look, whether God actually I
Right.
should say, whether God actually endorsed Samson's decision to do that, I don't know. I'm kind of agnostic about that. One day we'll see God face to face and we can
That could be
ask
one of our
God, well, what about that place in Judges, chapter 16? Is that, were the parents right that you wouldn't want that? Or was
Or
the
you-
author right that you did?
You did want that.
But what I like is that the authors of Judges have a more complicated view of how God interacts with us, because sometimes God works through really terrible, not so great things in order to accomplish ends which are good, but which we couldn't have conceived of as possible or good at the time. So they're working on it.
Yes. Whole thing is a mess. And the things that Samson does and doesn't do are messy and sometimes probably pretty hard to align with God in the ways you'd like to.
Yeah.
Right? Not as straightforward as certainly not like in Deuteronomy, right? Where it's just like a 1-2 relationship.
And I think it's important that even though here, this is a particular bad choice that God seems, for God's own mysterious reasons, to have endorsed, that's not universal across all of Judges. God does not endorse every decision that these people make, even when those decisions don't immediately lead to ruin. Often the author of Judges is completely silent about what God has to do with something.
Anything. Yeah. I'm thinking about what's his name's daughter?
Jephthah.
Jephthah.
Yes, that's
Jephthah's
exactly right.
daughters.
Give us a story.
So Jephthah was a mighty warrior, and he was fighting the Ammonites. At one point, he makes this oath to God, which whether or not God actually needs or wants is a different question, right? And he says, if you give them into my hands, then whoever comes out of the doors of my house first to meet me, when I return victorious, will be offered up by me as a burnt offering. And of course, the first person when he gets home is his daughter, his one and only child, who comes home. And he's miserable and he's crying, and his daughter's like, well, you got to do what you said to God you were due. But first, let me, mourn for a couple months before you offer me up as a burnt offering. But if you think back in Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus, we're not supposed to need human offerings.
No, it's one of the major messages of the book of Genesis, as well as the particular message of the story of Abraham and
Absolutely.
Isaac. The God of Israel
Does not require or want anything to do with that.
No, this God does not demand human sacrifice at a time in the Bronze Age when there were religious groups that were still practicing human sacrifice. These are Iron Age texts depicting a Bronze Age civilization, and during the Bronze Age, human sacrifice was par for the course.
Pretty, typical.
And so this, but I think the most noteworthy thing is that the Jephthah and his daughter go through with this. He sacrifices his daughter in order to make good his vow, but the author of Judges never says that God said to do this, and never says that God accepted the sacrifice. God is completely silent and invisible during this whole story. That whole story. God never appears. They think that God wants them to do such and such,
Mhm.
but Judges never says that God does or doesn't.
Right. The only mention of God is that God gave them victory.
Right.
And that's it.
That's it. God gives them victory. That's his involvement. The rest of this superstitious, in the technical sense, superstitious game that they're playing, right, is just them.
Is just, it's their own decisions and their own thinking about what they think God wants of them.
There it is. See, I wonder how many times we in our lives project some idea onto God that is not actually God's, and then we hold ourselves to it. Like, what demand do we think God makes on us that actually God has not made himself?
Yeah, that's rough. I think we do that a lot.
I think we do that a lot too. And we've talked about how much the Hebrew scriptures at this point seem to be projecting a lot of their personal ideas about God onto the character of God. Maybe God didn't actually do all the things that, these stories ascribe to God, such as, condoning, maybe I'm just leaving it open, condoning Samson's decision to go out and marry a Philistine woman.
Right.
But what I like about the book of Judges is that gradually, by degrees, the authors of these texts are realizing that they're doing this. And they are giving us more complicated pictures, and also moments like this where God has nothing visibly or explicitly to do with the situation that the characters think is all about what God is doing. The authors realizing, maybe this is us, not God, in real time in the course of the writing of this narrative.
Yeah. That's really, I think that's something, because if you think about it, through when we were reading Exodus and Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy, and even Joshua, it was very clear God says this, right? God is happy they did this. God is mad they did this. But we don't have God as an active character in a lot of Judges anymore.
Sometimes, but not all the time.
But not all the time. Little bits of him here and there.
And the times when he's not there, I think, are super important, like this one.
They're supposed to be the mouthpiece for God, but instead they're making God their mouthpiece for whatever they want.
True. So there are a couple of things I think we should say about the account of human nature in Judges before we move on to
Ruth.
something very different.
Very different in Ruth.
To go back to Abimelech, we said we would come back to him. Abimelech is the son of Gideon. He is Gideon's successor. And Abimelech wants to become a king. And Gideon is not a king. Gideon is not a king. Gideon is a judge, but Abimelech wants to be a king. And he tries to accomplish this in a couple of ways. One is he gets enough elders to sign up for such a thing. Then he kills most of his other brothers. He doesn't manage to kill them all, which ends up being his undoing.
Something.
Yeah, he's got a lot of brothers. But part of the lesson is that Abimelech, who only rules Israel for 3 years, it says, Abimelech is the only person who is willing to exercise absolute authority, the kind of authority that a monarch would have. And he pursues it, right? It's not like he's born a monarch or he is anointed a monarch by a prophet. That's what we're going to see in the eventual monarchy, the legitimate monarchy of Israel with Saul and David and Solomon. This guy pursues kingship on his own. The only person who is willing to exercise absolute authority is the person least suited to exercise such authority. I think that the book of Judges is trying to articulate a theory of human nature according to which, it would be much more efficient for Israel to be ruled by a dictator, by somebody with absolute authority, but there is nobody who could possibly be trusted with that power who is willing to and able to do that. And we're going to see that even after Israel gets a legitimate monarchy, those monarchs turn out in their own ways, not to have what it takes the whole time.
No, certainly not the whole time.
This is a theory of human nature that I think has been very influential on modern governments. I mean, I think it's the theory of nature that's in James Madison's contributions to the Federalist Papers. Madison said, if all men were angels, you wouldn't need a government. And that's absolutely true. The fact is we are not. When you have no way of managing the facts of human nature, crooked timber of humanity, you end up with a lot of trouble.
Yeah. I think I mentioned to you before we started filming this that I feel like Judges is summed up so well by the last verse of Judges, which is, in those days there was no king in Israel. All the people did what was right in their own eyes.
Yikes.
And
this is the polar opposite of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's state of nature.
No,
Rousseau says that if there was no government or state or community like structure, that we would all live, beautiful, peaceful, lovely lives. And Judges is the complete and polar opposite.
It's the other kind of state. Yeah.
The other state of nature, it's Hobbes's
It's
state of
Hobbes'
nature.
state of nature that is,
It's a mess.
everyone's out for themselves.
Oh, yikes. And they do. Judges leaves off the narrative with a civil war in Israel. The tribe of Benjamin we don't have to go into the story, which is pretty gruesome and definitely rated R for a lot of reasons.
For a lot of reasons.
There's sexual violence, there's violence, there's war. Anyway, Israel ends up at war with itself. It is a death spiral for post-Joshua self-rule of Israel in the promised land. And I kind of have to feel for God at this point, because God's trying to be the king. God's trying to rule these people and just has not figured out how to do it. And so God's next attempt is going to be, okay, how about I make a human being a king? And they can't be somebody like Abimelech. They can't want it. They can't want it.
Mm-hmm.
That's not going to work. But maybe if I find somebody who doesn't want it and make them the king, maybe that'll work.
Mm-hmm.
We'll just wait and see.
Yeah, we'll
what
talk
happens.
about all that for Samuel.
So let's talk about Ruth for a moment. Ruth has a much more positive.
Oh, it's a fuzzy, warm book to read right after Judges in the Civil War, because Ruth doesn't really have an enemy except for maybe death.
Yeah.
It doesn't have like a villain in it. Instead, it's just a story of good people with good intentions trying to live right. Eventually, in this case, they are blessed, which, as we said earlier, it's complicated. It doesn't always work like that. But Ruth's even more realistic in many ways than Numbers, Deuteronomy, etc. Because it starts with a lot of suffering. Right?
Yeah. So there's a woman named Naomi, and Naomi's husband dies. Naomi has 2 sons, and each of these 2 sons is married to a Moabite, aka not an Israelite, somebody from a foreign nation. But then both of Naomi's sons die. And so you've got 3 widows. In this society, that would have been seriously bad news for them economically and otherwise. They have nothing. This is why the law of Moses in Leviticus and Deuteronomy calls the people of Israel to care particularly for widows, orphans, and strangers or foreigners who are residing among them, because these would be the most vulnerable people in their society. So Naomi tries to send both of her daughters-in-law away and says, oh, go remarry. Okay, that's what you need to do. And one of her daughters-in-law does. That's what she does. And she goes with her mother-in-law's blessing. But Naomi's other daughter-in-law, named Ruth, says, no, I'm going to stay with you. And your God is going to be my God. Your people are going to be my people. That's verse 15 and 16 of chapter 1. And then the rest of the book of Ruth is the story of how Naomi gets a husband for Ruth.
Yes. And it's a good, like I said, a good feeling story. But I think it's more realistic than some of the other ones, because Ruth and Naomi, they seem to be good people, right? In the beginning. And yet by the end of chapter 1, when she returns home, says, do not call me Naomi anymore. Call me Mara, which means bitter, right?
She's in serious mourning.
She's lost her husband and both of her children and her life, her everything. The Lord has dealt harshly with me, is what she says. Through it, God works goodness back into her life. We end with all the neighborhood women saying, look what God has done.
It is a realistic portrayal of human life, because what we've gotten a lot of so far has been, realistic about the chaos of human society, the chaos inside of each one of us, the chaos of human nature. And that is true, but that's not the whole story. A lot of it's our fault, but not all of it. Sometimes chaos happens to us, and that's what happens here. It doesn't say that Ruth and Naomi and the other daughter-in-law, it doesn't say that their husbands, deserve to die or anything like that. It just says that they died.
They just died,
and then they were sad. They were in grief. And boy, isn't that something that we deal with every single day in the life of the parish and the life of our families. People suffer, people get sick, and they die. And then you have to figure out how to relive your life.
Sure.
That's what Ruth and Naomi end up doing with the help of this guy, this distant relative named Boaz, who ends up, through a little bit of trickery, but trickery which Boaz
Meant
ends up
well.
embracing, and
Yeah.
he had it had an okay intention, but ends up marrying Ruth. And then Boaz and Ruth have children, and those children have other children, and on down the line to a man named Jesse, who's
Not even that many. They have children, and then his child is Jesse. And then his child is David.
And you have to imagine, for the readers of this text, their spines would have just been tingling.
Oh, absolutely. That's a moment of, wait a second, right? This is this woman who was not even Jewish, is the mother of one of the most important lines,
The mother of the king,
mother of the king.
and is going to be the mother of the
The
messianic
king.
line too, this continual wellspring of hope for the people of Israel, and then subsequently for the whole world. That's probably where we should end for today. You've gotten the good, the bad, and the ugly between the books of Judges and Ruth here. It's been a pleasure to walk through it with you. Please like, share, and click subscribe wherever, however it is you get your podcasts. Help us to share the good news of the God of the Bible with the world in great need of him. Till next time.